The streets of New York in the early 1900s were a labyrinth of chaos and opportunity, teeming with immigrants chasing the elusive promise of the American dream. Among the crowded tenements and narrow alleys of Lower Manhattan, the young Salvatore Lucania, who would later become known as Lucky Luciano, walked a path few could survive, let alone thrive upon. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, coal smoke, and unfulfilled ambition, a city alive with energy yet rife with danger. Every corner seemed to whisper possibilities, but also threats. Gangs controlled blocks with fists and fear, and the law was often a distant, ineffectual presence. Luciano, barely a boy, learned quickly that survival required more than strength. It required cunning, observation, and an instinct for timing that seemed almost preternatural. As he grew, the streets became both his classroom and his battlefield. He watched older boys fight, cheat, and manipulate their way to small pockets of power, internalizing lessons about loyalty and betrayal that would later define the architecture of his criminal empire. The pulse of the city was relentless, and Luciano's awareness of the constant tension between order and chaos sharpened his mind. He saw how rival gangs carved out territories, how alliances were fragile, and how a single misstep could mean a lifetime of hardship or death. In this crucible, ambition became survival, and survival became a form of artistry. Even as a teenager, Luciano exhibited a rare combination of charm and ruthlessness. He understood the subtle power of words, gestures, and the appearance of calm in moments of violence. While other boys relied purely on brute strength, Luciano cultivated patience, foresight, and the ability to read people as if they were open books. Every handshake, every conversation, every glance held significance. He observed how fear could be wielded as effectively as a weapon and how respect, once earned, could become a shield against countless threats. The neighborhoods themselves were microcosms of a larger world. Italian immigrants clung tightly to their cultural traditions while simultaneously navigating the brutality of urban survival. Luciano's family, like many others, faced poverty, limited opportunity, and the constant pressure to protect what little they had. Within this environment, morality was often a matter of practicality rather than principle. Luciano internalized lessons about compromise, negotiation, and the subtle balance between loyalty and self-interest. These early experiences planted the seeds of a mind that would one day restructure organized crime itself. By the time he reached adolescence, Luciano was no longer just a street-smart boy, he was a strategist observing the hierarchies around him. He noticed the power structures within gangs, the unspoken codes of conduct, and the ways in which certain individuals manipulated both fear and respect to maintain control. He began forming his own alliances, testing loyalty, and understanding the intricate dance between dominance and subservience. Each encounter, each small victory or setback, was a lesson etched into his psyche, sharpening the instincts that would later allow him to rise above the chaos surrounding him. Even in these formative years, there were glimpses of the man he would become, the balance of charm, intellect, and cold calculation that could inspire loyalty and command fear simultaneously. While others saw the streets as merely dangerous, Luciano saw them as a chessboard, each move requiring foresight and strategy. The city's relentless energy, its opportunities and threats, molded him into someone who could not only survive but dominate. The shadows of New York's underworld whispered promises of power and warned of ruin, and Luciano, ever watchful, began learning to listen carefully to both. In those early years, the boy who would become the architect of modern organized crime was quietly absorbing every lesson the streets offered. He was learning that power could be gained as much through intellect and patience as through violence, and that every relationship, every alliance, was both an opportunity and a potential liability. The streets of New York, in all their raw, unfiltered intensity, became the proving ground for Luciano's emerging genius, a genius that would one day transform the very nature of crime, leaving a legacy that would haunt the underworld long after his death. The island of Sicily, with its sun-baked hills and narrow, winding streets, was a place of contrasts, beauty and brutality, tradition and survival. Salvatore Lucania was born into this world, in the small town of Lercara Fritti, a community that clung to its roots while wrestling with poverty, superstition, and simmering tensions between families. Life in Sicily was harsh, but it taught lessons that would resonate throughout Luciano's life: loyalty, cunning, the importance of reputation, and the ever-present shadow of betrayal. From an early age, he witnessed how disputes over land, honor, and survival could escalate into violence, and how every action carried consequences far beyond immediate comprehension. The Lucania family, like many Sicilian immigrants, was driven by the hope of a better life, and that hope eventually brought them to the crowded, chaotic streets of New York. The transition from Sicily to the United States was jarring. The old-world customs and codes clashed with the brutal realities of life in the immigrant neighborhoods of Manhattan and Brooklyn. Families were packed into tenements, struggling with meager wages, unsanitary conditions, and the constant threat of exploitation. For young Luciano, this environment became a crucible where ambition and survival instincts fused. He learned to navigate the delicate balance between integration and cultural preservation, between obedience to his family and the necessity of self-reliance. In these early years in New York, Luciano was surrounded by a city alive with opportunity, yet governed by invisible rules enforced by gangs, local bosses, and a justice system often blind to the lives of the poor. The neighborhoods he inhabited were a maze of small businesses, social clubs, and shadowy alleys where one wrong step could lead to humiliation, injury, or death. Every interaction was a test, every conversation a potential lesson. Young Luciano observed patterns: who commanded respect, how disputes were settled, and how some men wielded charm and intelligence as effectively as weapons. He began to understand that power was not simply about violence, but about perception, influence, and strategy. Family life in these immigrant neighborhoods was a mix of warmth, discipline, and strict adherence to cultural norms. But it was also a world where men had to assert themselves to survive, where the failures of one could endanger many. Luciano absorbed these lessons with a keen mind, understanding the value of foresight, patience, and calculated risk. At the same time, the streets offered temptations and distractions, from petty crimes to social clubs where young men learned early the currency of respect and reputation. These formative experiences taught him that intelligence and observation could be as crucial as strength, and that alliances, even temporary ones, were often the keys to survival. By his teenage years, Luciano had begun to test his own abilities. He participated in minor criminal activities, not merely for profit but to explore the dynamics of influence and control. He observed rival gangs, noting their strengths and weaknesses, and experimented with forming relationships that could later be leveraged for advantage. While other boys relied on brute force, Luciano relied on calculation, charm, and timing. He quickly learned that patience could yield far greater rewards than impulsive action, a philosophy that would guide him throughout his rise to power. Education was sporadic and informal, but life itself became Luciano's school. Every incident, from family disputes to encounters with law enforcement, became a lesson in human behavior, strategy, and risk management. He observed how loyalty could be demanded but not bought, how fear could enforce obedience, and how trust was always fragile. These lessons, learned in the crowded streets and cramped homes of New York's immigrant communities, were shaping a mind capable of strategic thinking and moral flexibility, a mind ready to navigate a world where ambition and danger were inseparable. The combination of Sicilian heritage, New York hardship, and an instinctive understanding of human nature gave Luciano a unique perspective. He saw the world in terms of opportunity and risk, relationships and leverage, influence and control. Unlike others who saw only the chaos of the streets, he began to see patterns, hierarchies, and openings, ways to gain power without being destroyed by it. His early experiences instilled in him a sense of purpose and a hunger for more than mere survival. They planted the seeds of ambition that would grow into a vision of an organized underworld, one that combined the discipline of business with the ruthless efficiency of crime. By the time he approached young adulthood, Luciano's identity was taking shape. He was no longer just a Sicilian immigrant or a street-smart teenager, he was an observer, a strategist, and a man with a nascent understanding of how to wield power in a complex, dangerous world. These years of struggle, adaptation, and observation would define his character, preparing him for the rise that would not only change his life but transform the very nature of organized crime in America. The lessons of loyalty, cunning, and survival learned in Sicily and New York would become the foundation of a criminal empire, and the groundwork for the secret that would haunt him until his final days. The transition from adolescence to early adulthood marked the beginning of Salvatore Luciano's deliberate descent into the criminal underworld. No longer just a keen observer of the streets, he became an active participant in their dangerous rhythm, testing the limits of his cunning and daring. New York in the 1910s and 1920s was a city of extremes. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, opportunity coexisted with exploitation, and the streets were ruled by gangs who demanded both loyalty and fear. In this environment, Luciano's sharp intellect and natural charisma gave him an edge, allowing him to navigate the treacherous maze of rival factions, petty crime, and law enforcement scrutiny. Luciano's first forays into organized crime were small but significant. He began with petty thefts, street-level cons, and neighborhood protection schemes, learning to read both people and situations with an instinctive precision. These early crimes were not only about survival or financial gain, they were a testing ground for strategy, observation, and risk management. Every transaction, every confrontation, every alliance offered lessons in human behavior, trust, and deception. He noticed patterns others missed: how fear could be leveraged more effectively than violence, how alliances could be built with charm as easily as intimidation, and how timing could transform a small act into a powerful advantage. By his late teens, Luciano's reputation had begun to spread. He was no longer just a street kid, he was a figure whose cleverness, audacity, and emerging leadership made him stand out among peers and rivals alike. His ability to inspire loyalty while simultaneously intimidating others became a defining trait. Luciano was learning that power was rarely won through brute force alone, it required strategy, patience, and the ability to manipulate perception. In a world dominated by quick tempers and impulsive decisions, his measured approach set him apart and allowed him to ascend while others faltered. During these years, the alliances he formed were as crucial as his individual acts. Luciano gravitated toward ambitious peers who shared his vision of power and influence, forming networks that would later become the backbone of his empire. These relationships were fluid, built on mutual benefit rather than unquestioned loyalty, and Luciano proved adept at navigating the fragile balance between trust and self-interest. Betrayal was ever present, a silent threat lurking behind every handshake, and Luciano quickly learned to anticipate, exploit, and protect against it. His psychological acuity, the ability to read intentions, anticipate reactions, and exploit weaknesses, became an invaluable asset. The era also exposed him to the complex intersection of crime and politics, and the subtle ways in which corruption could be leveraged. He witnessed law enforcement officers turning a blind eye in exchange for favors, politicians exploiting gangs for votes, and influential businessmen manipulating street-level crime for profit. Luciano internalized these lessons. True power extended beyond the streets and required understanding the broader ecosystem of influence, negotiation, and compromise. He realized that control could be exerted not only through violence but through strategy, alliances, and the careful cultivation of a reputation. Despite the growing sophistication of his criminal activities, Luciano never abandoned the lessons of his youth. He remained acutely aware of the stakes, understanding that a single miscalculation could lead to ruin or death. This awareness sharpened his instincts, making him both cautious and audacious, a rare combination that allowed him to take calculated risks others would avoid. It was during these formative years that the foundations of his psychological approach to crime were laid, a blend of charm, intimidation, strategic foresight, and a willingness to act decisively when opportunity arose. Luciano's early criminal career also revealed his fascination with the structures of power. While other gang members relied on violence and fear to maintain control, he observed the efficiency of organization and the potential of coordinated operations. He began thinking not just in terms of immediate gain, but of long-term influence, territory control, and the establishment of a network that could survive beyond any one individual. This strategic vision, combined with his street-hardened experience, marked him as a rising force in New York's underworld, a man capable of shaping, rather than merely surviving, the criminal landscape. By the time Luciano reached his early 20s, he had fully emerged as a street-level strategist with growing influence. The petty crimes of his adolescence had evolved into carefully orchestrated schemes, the alliances of necessity had become partnerships of mutual ambition, and his understanding of human psychology had become a tool of power. He had learned to navigate chaos, manipulate perception, and exploit opportunity with a precision that few could match. These early steps into crime were more than just survival, they were the deliberate laying of groundwork for an empire, a blueprint that would one day transform organized crime in America. Even as he engaged in the violent, unpredictable world of New York streets, Luciano maintained a clear sense of direction. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who were consumed by immediate gain or petty revenge, he thought in terms of structure, influence, and legacy. Every action, every connection, every risk was part of a larger plan, a vision of a criminal enterprise that could endure and adapt. It was in these years that the street kid became a visionary, a man capable of seeing the potential in chaos and the opportunity in danger. His first steps into crime were not just acts of rebellion or survival, they were the opening moves of a carefully orchestrated rise to power that would change the underworld forever. As Lucky Luciano moved from the chaotic streets of New York into early adulthood, he began to distinguish himself from the countless other young men scrambling for survival in the city's underworld. Where many relied solely on brute force, quick tempers, or blind loyalty to their immediate superiors, Luciano demonstrated something far more sophisticated, a vision. He saw the potential to transform the fragmented, violent gangs into a coordinated and efficient network, one that could operate like a business, with rules, hierarchy, and an eye toward profit rather than petty rivalry. This vision marked the birth of a strategist, a man whose ambition was matched by his intelligence and psychological acuity. Luciano's rise was not immediate, nor was it without resistance. The underworld was a battlefield of competing personalities, old-world traditions, and entrenched power structures. Established bosses were wary of newcomers, especially those who challenged conventional norms or dared to think beyond immediate territory disputes. Yet, Luciano's unique combination of charm, charisma, and cunning allowed him to navigate these treacherous waters. He cultivated relationships with influential figures, identifying allies who could advance his goals and neutralizing threats before they became insurmountable. Each encounter, each negotiation, was approached with precision, foresight, and a subtle understanding of human nature. The turning point in Luciano's ascent came as he began to formalize the principles that would later define his empire. He understood that chaos was both an obstacle and an opportunity. Rivals were preoccupied with conflicts over territory, while law enforcement often responded inconsistently to crime. Luciano recognized that by imposing structure on this chaos, he could consolidate power without relying solely on violence. He sought to create a system in which loyalty was incentivized, betrayal was punished, and operations were run efficiently. In doing so, he began to envision the first modern model of organized crime, an empire that prioritized organization, profit, and influence over mere intimidation. Crucial to this rise was Luciano's ability to identify and leverage talent. He surrounded himself with men who complemented his abilities, individuals capable of executing his vision while also serving as trusted lieutenants. Figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were not merely associates, they were strategic partners, men whose intelligence, connections, and audacity enhanced Luciano's reach. Together, they formed a network of influence that blurred the lines between street-level crime and sophisticated enterprise, combining financial acumen with a ruthless willingness to eliminate obstacles. This network was not built overnight, it was forged through careful calculation, trust testing, and the ability to balance camaraderie with constant vigilance against betrayal. During this period, Luciano also honed the psychological tools that would define his leadership style. He understood that power was as much about perception as it was about action. Maintaining an aura of calm authority, projecting confidence, and cultivating an image that commanded respect were all deliberate choices. He recognized that fear alone could achieve obedience, but respect, and the perception of inevitability, was what ensured loyalty and minimized chaos. In effect, Luciano was teaching the underworld a new language of influence, one that combined intimidation, strategic generosity, and subtle manipulation to achieve goals without unnecessary bloodshed. The cultural context of the time further amplified Luciano's advantage. Prohibition had created an unprecedented market for illicit goods and services, providing not only vast profits but also the social acceptance of organized crime as a necessary, if clandestine, enterprise. Luciano's genius was his ability to exploit this opportunity while maintaining control over both his network and his rivals. Where others saw risk and disorder, he saw potential, the chance to unify disparate factions, streamline operations, and transform scattered criminal endeavors into a cohesive, powerful enterprise. Yet the rise of Luciano was not purely a story of ambition and strategy, it was also a narrative of calculated adaptation. He carefully studied his enemies, understanding their weaknesses, temperaments, and ambitions. He observed the tendencies of law enforcement and political figures, noting where corruption, complacency, or self-interest could be leveraged. Every move was deliberate, every decision informed by a combination of instinct, intelligence, and long-term planning. In this sense, Luciano's ascent was both organic and meticulously engineered, the product of a mind that could envision the endgame long before most could even conceive of a strategy. By the mid-1920s, the streets of New York had begun to reflect Luciano's influence, even if subtly. Rival gangs noticed his strategic alliances and measured approach, law enforcement observed a new level of coordination among criminal operations, and those within his network recognized a leader whose vision promised not only personal gain but also survival and stability in a world defined by volatility. Luciano was no longer just a rising figure, he was a force capable of redefining the very rules of the underworld. It was during this period that Luciano began experimenting with structural innovations that would later become legendary. He promoted the idea of compartmentalization, delegating authority while maintaining ultimate control. He instituted codes of conduct and implicit hierarchies, balancing discipline with flexibility. Loyalty was rewarded, while betrayal carried consequences severe enough to deter subversion but measured enough to avoid unnecessary disruption. Through these early innovations, Luciano was shaping an empire capable of enduring pressures both internal and external, a framework that would allow him to maintain influence even under the harshest scrutiny. This phase of Luciano's life was as much psychological as it was operational. He became acutely aware of his own instincts, learning when to act decisively and when to observe. He understood that the perception of power could rival power itself in effectiveness, and he used this insight to command attention and respect. Every gesture, word, and decision was calibrated to reinforce his authority, while simultaneously minimizing exposure to vulnerability. In mastering both the practical and psychological dimensions of leadership, Luciano was forging the blueprint of a new kind of criminal empire, one that combined the discipline of strategy, the foresight of a tactician, and the ruthlessness necessary to survive in a violent, unpredictable environment. By the end of this transformative period, Lucky Luciano had evolved from a street-savvy adolescent into a visionary leader with the intellect, charisma, and ruthlessness necessary to orchestrate an empire. He had learned to navigate the delicate balance between loyalty and fear, ambition and pragmatism, visibility and discretion. The foundations of organized crime were being redefined under his guidance, and the principles he established during these years would not only elevate him above his contemporaries but also cement his place as the architect of a modern criminal underworld. The rise of Luciano was not just a personal ascent, it was the emergence of a paradigm shift, a new order in the shadowed world of power, crime, and influence. Luciano's genius was not merely in his ability to rise through the ranks of New York's underworld, it lay in his unprecedented vision of crime as a structured, organized enterprise. While other mobsters relied primarily on violence and intimidation to maintain control over their neighborhoods, Luciano understood that power could be amplified, and preserved, through organization, strategy, and the careful orchestration of human resources. He treated the criminal underworld not as a chaotic battlefield but as a complex system, one that could be managed like a legitimate business, with hierarchies, divisions of labor, and meticulously controlled operations. This mindset marked the emergence of a new era in organized crime, and it was Luciano who would become the architect of that transformation. At the heart of this approach was the realization that money and influence could be maximized by minimizing unnecessary conflict. Luciano studied the patterns of rival gangs, understanding that violence, while often effective in the short term, was costly and destabilizing. He sought to redirect the energies of his associates toward coordinated operations, creating clear chains of command and assigning responsibilities based on skill and reliability. Gambling operations, bootlegging, and prostitution rings were not just sources of revenue, they were components of a carefully managed network, each element reinforcing the others and ensuring that the organization remained resilient under pressure. Luciano's organizational acumen extended beyond mere logistics. He recognized the psychological levers that could be used to maintain loyalty and discipline among his associates. Fear, while a powerful motivator, was insufficient alone. Respect, perception, and the careful cultivation of mutual dependence were equally essential. Associates who demonstrated loyalty and competence were rewarded with protection, opportunity, and advancement, while those who betrayed the organization faced consequences designed to maintain order without provoking unnecessary chaos. In this way, Luciano created an environment in which members were both incentivized and restrained, a system in which human behavior was managed as carefully as the money flowing through the enterprise. The alliances Luciano forged were as strategic as they were ambitious. He sought out men with complementary skills, tacticians who could navigate legal and political pressures, enforcers who could maintain order and discipline, and financiers who could manage the flow of illicit revenue. Individuals like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were more than accomplices, they were trusted lieutenants whose expertise amplified Luciano's vision. Each played a distinct role in a larger structure that prioritized efficiency, communication, and long-term survival. Luciano understood that the strength of his organization would ultimately depend not just on the loyalty of its members but on the careful orchestration of their talents. Another revolutionary aspect of Luciano's approach was his focus on neutralizing unnecessary rivalries. He brokered truces between gangs that had been locked in endless cycles of revenge, establishing a foundation for cooperation in pursuit of mutual profit. By creating a climate in which disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence, Luciano increased operational efficiency and reduced the risks inherent in uncontrolled conflict. He also implemented mechanisms for enforcing these agreements, ensuring that his authority was recognized not only within his immediate network but across the broader landscape of organized crime in New York. The psychology of loyalty and obedience under Luciano's leadership was nuanced and carefully considered. He understood that power was not only enforced through punishment but also through perception, charisma, and the careful calibration of authority. By demonstrating strategic generosity, rewarding initiative, and projecting an aura of inevitability, Luciano ensured that his subordinates were both motivated and compliant. In this sense, he operated as much like a corporate CEO as a traditional mob boss. He delegated responsibility, maintained oversight, and carefully balanced incentives and deterrents to achieve the desired behavior. Prohibition provided the perfect backdrop for Luciano's organizational model to flourish. The illegal liquor trade offered vast profits, and the federal government's inconsistent enforcement created an environment ripe for exploitation. Luciano capitalized on this moment in history, turning bootlegging operations into highly organized enterprises that generated enormous wealth while minimizing internal conflict and maximizing operational efficiency. Other criminal leaders were impressed by his ability to coordinate large-scale operations, while rivals quickly recognized that his organizational prowess made him a force beyond the reach of conventional methods of control. Luciano's approach was also forward-looking. He anticipated that law enforcement, rivalries, and public attention would continue to evolve, and he built resilience into his structure accordingly. By compartmentalizing operations, delegating responsibility, and maintaining multiple layers of oversight, he ensured that his network could survive the loss of individuals, temporary setbacks, and external pressures. This strategic flexibility was as important as the financial and territorial gains he achieved, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both risk management and long-term planning. Under Luciano's leadership, crime became more than a means of survival or brute accumulation of power, it became a system governed by rules, efficiency, and strategy. The underworld was transformed from a chaotic, violent arena into a disciplined, hierarchical network capable of sustaining immense wealth and influence. This transformation would not only elevate Luciano above his contemporaries but also redefine the very nature of organized crime in America, setting a standard for structure, leadership, and strategic thinking that would endure for decades. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to merge the practical and psychological dimensions of power. He orchestrated operations with the precision of a general, managed human behavior like a psychologist, and maintained a vision that extended far beyond immediate gains. In doing so, he built an empire capable of surviving internal betrayal, external pressure, and the ever-present chaos of life on the streets. The business of crime, under Luciano, became an art form, a combination of calculated risk, strategic foresight, and psychological mastery that few could rival, and none could ignore. By the end of this period, Lucky Luciano had not only accumulated wealth and influence, he had fundamentally altered the rules of organized crime. His methods demonstrated that power was most effectively wielded through intelligence, structure, and human insight rather than sheer violence. In the process, he had set the stage for the modern mafia, creating a blueprint that combined operational efficiency, loyalty management, and strategic ambition. The empire he began to build was more than just an organization, it was a new paradigm for criminal power, one that would reverberate through the underworld for generations to come. Luciano's rise was inseparable from the relationships he built, both in loyalty and rivalry. The underworld of New York was a complex ecosystem of allies, competitors, and opportunists, where every interaction carried potential opportunity, and hidden danger. Luciano quickly understood that a leader's power depended not only on the strength of his organization but on the careful management of human relationships. Allies could amplify influence, but rivals could destroy a carefully constructed empire. Navigating these dynamics required psychological insight, strategic negotiation, and an uncanny ability to anticipate betrayal before it occurred. Among his closest allies was Meyer Lansky, whose financial acumen complemented Luciano's strategic genius. Lansky understood numbers, investments, and the subtleties of laundering profits, allowing Luciano to expand operations beyond street-level crime. Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel added a combination of audacity and charisma, providing the muscle and daring that executed Luciano's plans with precision. These partnerships were more than friendships, they were calculated alliances forged for mutual benefit, each member aware that their collective success depended on discipline, discretion, and loyalty. Luciano's brilliance was in recognizing these strengths and integrating them into a cohesive network that functioned like a well-oiled machine. Yet for every ally, there was a potential rival. The streets were populated with ambitious men who coveted power, territory, and respect. Figures like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano represented both challenges and opportunities. Luciano's approach to these adversaries was methodical, he studied their tendencies, tested their loyalties, and sought openings for influence or negotiation. He understood that direct confrontation could be costly, but carefully orchestrated alliances or betrayals could reshape the balance of power in his favor. Each move was a calculated risk, requiring patience and psychological finesse. The nature of betrayal was ever present in this world, and Luciano internalized its lessons early. He observed how trust could be weaponized, how loyalty could be purchased temporarily but rarely permanently guaranteed. This awareness informed his leadership style, teaching him to balance openness with caution, generosity with vigilance, and strategic patience with decisive action. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to maintain authority without appearing domineering, to inspire loyalty without fostering fear that would backfire, and to manipulate rivalries in ways that strengthened rather than weakened his position. Romantic entanglements and personal relationships also played a role in the dynamics of power. Luciano's charm and magnetism allowed him to navigate social networks beyond the criminal sphere, cultivating influence with politicians, law enforcement officials, and business owners. These connections were leveraged strategically, providing both protection and opportunity. Yet the interplay of personal desire and ambition also carried risk. Romantic attachments could cloud judgment, create vulnerabilities, or offer rivals avenues for manipulation. Luciano's ability to navigate these complexities further demonstrated his keen understanding of human psychology and his capacity to integrate personal and professional strategy. Violence, when necessary, was precise and purposeful. Luciano did not revel in brutality for its own sake, he used it as a tool to enforce loyalty, eliminate threats, and communicate power. Hits were calculated, targeting specific rivals or dissidents in ways that reinforced discipline within his network. This approach distinguished him from less strategic criminals, who often acted impulsively or sought retribution without considering long-term consequences. Luciano's operations combined intelligence, foresight, and an understanding of human nature to maximize effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary exposure. The constant interplay of trust and betrayal shaped the internal culture of Luciano's organization. Members were rewarded for loyalty, initiative, and results, but they were also acutely aware of the consequences of disloyalty. Fear alone could compel obedience, but Luciano understood that respect and the perception of inevitability were equally powerful. He cultivated an atmosphere in which associates understood their value, their limitations, and the rules of engagement within the organization. Psychological leverage became as critical as financial or territorial control, reinforcing both compliance and efficiency. At the same time, Luciano's understanding of external threats, competitors, law enforcement, and the shifting landscape of politics, allowed him to maintain strategic advantage. He built networks that extended beyond New York, connecting with figures in other cities, establishing alliances that provided flexibility and protection. The ability to anticipate challenges before they arose, to act decisively without unnecessary risk, and to exploit both opportunity and weakness, became hallmarks of his leadership style. The combination of loyal allies, calculated rivals, and the constant management of human behavior was central to Luciano's ability to consolidate power. Each relationship, each negotiation, and each tactical move reinforced the structure of his emerging empire. The network he constructed was both resilient and adaptive, capable of withstanding internal betrayal and external pressures alike. Luciano's skill lay not merely in the accumulation of power but in the orchestration of relationships in a way that magnified influence, minimized risk, and ensured long-term dominance. By the end of this phase, Lucky Luciano had mastered the art of human dynamics within the underworld. He had surrounded himself with capable and loyal allies, neutralized or manipulated rivals, and internalized the lessons of trust and betrayal. These relationships, carefully calibrated and strategically managed, became the lifeblood of his organization. It was through this intricate web of alliances and rivalries that Luciano not only survived the violent chaos of New York streets but positioned himself to reshape the very nature of organized crime. Luciano's personal life was as intricate and calculated as his criminal empire, a complex interplay of desire, charm, and the pursuit of influence. While the streets and boardrooms of organized crime demanded discipline and strategy, they were also arenas where social prowess could be leveraged as effectively as muscle or money. Women, in particular, played a dual role in his life: companions, distractions, and sometimes instruments of subtle influence. Luciano's relationships were often intertwined with his ambitions, and he understood instinctively that charisma, attraction, and social networks could extend his reach beyond the limits of the underworld. He cultivated an image of sophistication and magnetism, one that could disarm adversaries and endear allies. Luciano's charm was not accidental, it was honed as a tool of power. His smile, his conversational skill, and his ability to read subtle cues allowed him to manipulate situations with precision. Women were drawn to him not just for his allure but for the aura of authority and control he projected. In his social circles, influence was currency, and Luciano spent it judiciously, forging bonds that could advance his strategic objectives. Yet these relationships also carried emotional and psychological risks. The entanglement of desire with ambition created vulnerabilities, exposing him to jealousy, betrayal, and distraction, forces that could imperil even the most carefully constructed empire. Luciano's approach to personal relationships mirrored his approach to crime: deliberate, strategic, and attentive to human psychology. He understood that every interaction had meaning, every conversation could be leveraged, and every bond could serve a purpose. But he was also aware that human emotion was unpredictable. The challenge lay in balancing personal indulgence with the discipline necessary to maintain power. He navigated this balance with remarkable skill, demonstrating an ability to compartmentalize, to enjoy pleasures without allowing them to compromise his broader objectives. Beyond the realm of personal relationships, Luciano's fascination with social dynamics extended into his interactions with political figures, law enforcement officials, and influential businesspeople. He recognized that cultivating these networks could provide protection, opportunity, and insight. Charm became a form of armor, a way to disarm suspicion and facilitate negotiation. Whether attending social gatherings, clandestine meetings, or public events, Luciano projected confidence and control, using charisma as a complement to his strategic mind. These interactions were not mere vanity, they were calculated maneuvers in the larger game of influence and power. Romance and power often collided in Luciano's life. He was known for his high-profile relationships, yet he rarely allowed emotional attachment to compromise his judgment. Women could be both companions and informants, sources of pleasure and potential liability. Luciano's skill lay in maintaining control over these dynamics, understanding human desires, and managing perception. His relationships reflected his understanding that influence was as much about psychology as it was about authority. Those who were drawn to him could be allies, or at the very least, neutralize threats. The interplay of desire, ambition, and power also offered insights into Luciano's character. Unlike other mobsters consumed purely by territory or profit, he recognized that human behavior, its weaknesses, motivations, and susceptibilities, was a tool to be understood and, when necessary, leveraged. His relationships revealed a capacity for both empathy and calculation, for connection and manipulation. This duality mirrored the contradictions that defined his life, a man capable of loyalty yet ruthless in betrayal, charming yet cold, ambitious yet disciplined. Even within his closest alliances, Luciano maintained a careful balance between intimacy and authority. He could inspire loyalty without overexposure, exert control without alienation, and forge bonds without compromising strategic advantage. This ability to navigate social hierarchies and emotional complexities extended his influence beyond immediate operations. By mastering the psychology of desire and attachment, he added an additional layer to his leadership, one that reinforced both loyalty and compliance among those around him. The social sphere also provided a lens through which Luciano could observe broader patterns of human behavior. Parties, clubs, and gatherings were arenas where alliances were tested, loyalties revealed, and power demonstrated subtly. Luciano used these settings to cultivate his image, gauge threats, and strengthen his network. Every gesture, conversation, and interaction became data, insight into how people reacted under pressure, how influence could be asserted, and how social perception could be manipulated. In essence, his personal life was an extension of his strategic mind, a laboratory where psychology, influence, and ambition intersected. While the streets demanded ruthlessness, and the boardrooms demanded calculation, the social world demanded adaptability, subtlety, and charisma. Luciano's mastery of these domains reflected a mind capable of integrating multiple layers of human behavior into a coherent strategy. His personal life, with all its pleasures, dangers, and complexities, was inseparable from his criminal enterprise. Each relationship, each alliance, each social maneuver reinforced his power, honed his instincts, and prepared him for the challenges ahead. By understanding desire, influence, and the psychology of human attachment, Luciano expanded his reach beyond the immediate realm of crime. He created a network of both tangible and intangible power, using charm, strategic relationships, and calculated intimacy to consolidate authority and maintain control. In this way, his personal life was not a distraction from his rise but an essential instrument of it, a subtle, sophisticated battlefield where loyalty, influence, and power were contested as fiercely as on the streets. The underworld of New York in the 1920s and 1930s was a world of hidden wars, silent assassinations, and subtle power plays, a place where survival demanded both cunning and audacity. Lucky Luciano, now firmly established as a rising power, found himself at the center of a complex web of conflict that extended far beyond street-level disputes. Rivalries between gangs were not only territorial but strategic, shaped by ambition, fear, and a constant quest for dominance. Violence was a tool, but one that had to be wielded with precision. A poorly timed hit, a misjudged alliance, or a public display of weakness could unravel years of careful planning and invite catastrophe. Luciano's ability to navigate these hidden conflicts became a defining feature of his leadership. He understood that overt confrontation was often costly and unpredictable, and he favored calculated interventions, negotiation, and strategic manipulation. He orchestrated hits when necessary, ensuring that each act of violence served a clear purpose, to eliminate threats, consolidate power, or send a message to both allies and enemies. These operations required meticulous planning, intelligence gathering, and a psychological understanding of his targets. The underworld, he realized, was as much a battlefield of perception as it was of action. Fear, respect, and reputation were as critical as guns and numbers. The complexity of this hidden war extended to alliances and betrayals. Luciano maintained networks of informants, collaborators, and allies, constantly reassessing loyalties and predicting potential shifts in allegiance. Trust was fragile, and betrayal was always a possibility, often coming from the most unexpected quarters. He studied the behaviors of his rivals, observed patterns of greed and ambition, and anticipated moves before they occurred. By doing so, Luciano could strike preemptively, neutralizing threats before they materialized into direct challenges. Each calculated move reinforced his reputation as both a strategic genius and a figure whose influence was inescapable. This era also saw Luciano navigating the pressures of law enforcement and political interference. While he operated largely in the shadows, federal agents, city police, and local officials all represented potential obstacles or instruments, depending on how they were managed. Bribery, influence, and strategic alliances with sympathetic officials became tools for survival and expansion. Luciano understood that the hidden war was not fought on the streets alone. It extended into offices, courtrooms, and social spheres, where subtle influence could achieve far more than overt confrontation. The psychological dimension of this conflict was equally important. Luciano recognized that fear could be cultivated and controlled to reinforce authority, but it had to be balanced with incentives to ensure loyalty. He created a culture in which associates understood the consequences of disloyalty but were motivated to follow directives through respect, opportunity, and the promise of mutual benefit. This balance of fear and respect was critical in maintaining control over a diverse and potentially volatile network, one in which personal ambition could easily clash with organizational objectives. The hidden war was not limited to rival gangs and law enforcement, it also unfolded within Luciano's own ranks. Ambitious lieutenants, enforcers, and associates were constantly evaluating their positions, testing loyalties, and seeking advantage. Luciano's challenge was to channel ambition in ways that strengthened the organization rather than undermined it. By carefully monitoring behavior, rewarding initiative, and applying discipline when necessary, he maintained cohesion and minimized internal disruption. His leadership was defined by a combination of psychological insight, tactical foresight, and decisive action. Prohibition amplified the stakes of this hidden war. The illicit liquor trade was immensely profitable but also fiercely contested. Competition for territory, distribution networks, and protection rackets created constant friction. Luciano approached these challenges with strategic calculation, leveraging alliances, orchestrating neutralizations of rivals, and consolidating operations to maximize both profit and influence. His ability to integrate intelligence, timing, and psychological insight into operational planning gave him a decisive advantage over less disciplined competitors. Each maneuver in this hidden war reflected Luciano's understanding of the long game. He did not seek short-term victories at the cost of strategic advantage. Instead, he aimed to reshape the underworld's power structures to create lasting influence. He balanced aggression with diplomacy, punishment with reward, and fear with respect, cultivating an environment in which his authority was both recognized and enduring. These principles allowed him to survive crises that would have destroyed others, reinforcing his image as a man whose power was as invisible as it was absolute. By the late 1920s, the hidden war had transformed the landscape of organized crime in New York. Luciano's calculated approach enabled him to neutralize threats, solidify alliances, and expand his influence without unnecessary chaos. His ability to combine strategic planning, psychological insight, and operational precision set him apart from contemporaries, marking him not just as a gang leader, but as a visionary capable of redefining the rules of criminal enterprise. The streets, alleys, and smoky back rooms of the city were his chessboard, and every move was a demonstration of foresight, control, and ruthless intelligence. Through careful orchestration of violence, diplomacy, and psychological leverage, Luciano established himself at the center of a network that extended influence across New York and beyond. The hidden war was waged in silence, its battles often invisible to the public eye, yet its consequences shaped the very structure of the underworld. In mastering this unseen battlefield, Luciano demonstrated a unique blend of tactical genius and psychological mastery, cementing his position as the undisputed architect of a new era in organized crime, an era defined by strategic intelligence, subtle coercion, and the careful management of both allies and enemies. The rise of Lucky Luciano, once meteoric, inevitably encountered the shadow of vulnerability, a reminder that in the underworld, no empire was impervious to collapse. Despite his strategic brilliance and careful orchestration of alliances, the forces of law, betrayal, and circumstance began to converge against him. The very networks that had propelled him to power contained hidden fissures, as ambition, envy, and shifting loyalties threatened to unravel the careful balance he had maintained. Luciano's life, once defined by momentum and control, now faced the delicate onset of decline, a stage in which the consequences of past decisions would collide with the relentless pressure of external forces. The first cracks appeared through the relentless scrutiny of law enforcement. While Luciano had long understood the value of discretion, the reach of federal authorities was expanding, and the political climate demanded accountability, even from those operating in the shadows. Investigations, subpoenas, and surveillance were no longer abstract threats. They became daily pressures that tested both his strategic planning and his psychological endurance. Each encounter with the law demanded careful calculation, as any misstep could expose vulnerabilities that rivals or betrayers were ready to exploit. Luciano's previously near-impervious networks were suddenly subject to forces beyond his control. Compounding this pressure was the growing ambition and impatience of allies and subordinates. In an empire built on loyalty, there remained the constant risk that those closest to him would see opportunity in his overextension. Rivalries within his own organization intensified, fueled by desire for influence, resentment at perceived slights, or fear of being left behind in the shifting hierarchy. Luciano had always anticipated challenges, but the combination of internal tension and external pressure created a precarious environment in which even a single lapse could have catastrophic consequences. He began to recognize that sustaining power required more than strategy. It demanded vigilance at every level, in every interaction, and in every corner of his sprawling network. Betrayal, a constant undercurrent throughout his rise, began to manifest in more tangible and dangerous forms. Former allies, once loyal or at least compliant, became potential threats, either motivated by personal gain or coerced by law enforcement seeking leverage. Luciano understood the subtle psychology of treachery. It often emerged where ambition intersected with opportunity, or where fear of reprisal was outweighed by the promise of reward. The landscape of loyalty he had meticulously constructed now required continuous reinforcement, monitoring, and occasional ruthlessness to maintain. Even minor misjudgments could snowball into crises that threatened both his reputation and his operational control. The pressures of public exposure and media attention further complicated matters. While much of the underworld remained cloaked in secrecy, high-profile arrests, sensational reporting, and gossip created a climate in which perception became nearly as important as reality. The mythos of Luciano's invincibility was vulnerable to erosion under public scrutiny, and rivals were quick to exploit any sign of weakness. He recognized that maintaining authority required not only action but the careful management of image, a balance between demonstrating strength and concealing vulnerability. Simultaneously, the legal machinery of the state became increasingly adept at leveraging informants, witnesses, and undercover operations. Luciano, whose network relied on compartmentalization and loyalty, faced the constant risk that exposure could cascade through his empire, unraveling years of careful construction. Arrests of associates, infiltration of operations, and the threat of testimony against him created a tension that pervaded every decision. Survival was no longer simply a matter of strategy or intimidation, it demanded psychological resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to anticipate moves in a game with high stakes and few margins for error. The personal dimension of his vulnerability also emerged during this period. Relationships, both intimate and professional, carried the risk of distraction, manipulation, or betrayal. Luciano's ability to separate personal indulgence from strategic necessity was tested repeatedly, as the interplay between emotion, ambition, and influence threatened to compromise his judgment. The careful compartmentalization that had served him so well in earlier years now required continuous reinforcement, as the consequences of lapses became far more severe. Financial pressures, too, began to surface. While his operations remained lucrative, law enforcement seizures, rival incursions, and disruptions to smuggling routes introduced uncertainty. Maintaining the flow of illicit revenue required adaptive strategy, rapid response, and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of both legal loopholes and criminal opportunity. Each financial decision carried both immediate and long-term implications, reinforcing the sense that the fall of an empire could be precipitated by factors both large and small. This period of mounting pressure marked a pivotal psychological transition for Luciano. The confidence and audacity that had propelled him to power now coexisted with awareness of mortality, vulnerability, and the fragility of even the most meticulously constructed networks. He became acutely aware that past successes could not guarantee future security, and that every decision carried amplified consequences. This consciousness shaped his behavior, leading to a mixture of caution, strategic ruthlessness, and heightened vigilance. By the time formal investigations and internal betrayals converged, Luciano's position, though formidable, was no longer unassailable. The fall had begun, not in a single dramatic event, but as a gradual erosion of invulnerability, an accumulation of pressures, exposures, and risks that together threatened the stability of his empire. In this stage, the genius of his ascent was tested as never before, revealing both the resilience and the limits of a man who had once seemed untouchable. The beginning of his downfall was thus both inevitable and instructive, illustrating the delicate interplay of power, psychology, and circumstance in the underworld. Luciano had mastered strategy, manipulation, and loyalty, yet he faced a stage in which forces beyond his control, law, betrayal, and chance, would challenge even his extraordinary abilities. The narrative of his rise now intertwined with the shadow of decline, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation with justice, ambition, and the consequences of a life built on both brilliance and risk. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was a public spectacle, a dramatic confrontation between the underworld and the institutions of law and order, and a defining moment that would shape the perception of organized crime in America. For years, Luciano had operated in the shadows, manipulating alliances, orchestrating operations, and maintaining an aura of untouchable authority. Now, the full weight of the legal system bore down on him. The courtroom became a stage where power, perception, and morality collided, and where Luciano's carefully constructed empire faced its first direct and highly visible test. From the outset, the trial was marked by intense scrutiny, both by the media and the public. Newspapers sensationalized every detail, painting Luciano as the embodiment of criminal audacity and moral corruption. Headlines emphasized the danger of organized crime and the audacity of a man who had dared to rise above the traditional constraints of the underworld. For the public, the trial was not merely about a single man's guilt or innocence, it symbolized the broader struggle between law, order, and the sprawling networks of crime that had quietly dominated city streets for years. Luciano's presence in the courtroom was both a performance and a calculated risk, every gesture, word, and expression would be interpreted, analyzed, and remembered. The prosecution sought to portray Luciano as the mastermind behind a sprawling criminal network, responsible not only for illegal operations but for instilling fear, orchestrating violence, and undermining the moral and social fabric of the city. Witnesses were called to testify about his influence, his operations, and the loyalty of his associates, while law enforcement presented evidence of his involvement in bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution rings. The case was meticulously constructed to illustrate not just isolated crimes but the systemic nature of his influence, aiming to demonstrate that Luciano's empire posed a threat that extended beyond individual acts of lawlessness. For Luciano, the trial demanded both composure and strategy. He had faced threats and challenges in the streets, but the courtroom was an entirely different arena, one where perception could determine fate. Every word he spoke, every reaction he displayed, was analyzed for signs of guilt, weakness, or defiance. The courtroom became a theater of psychological warfare, where Luciano's charisma, intelligence, and reputation were both weapons and shields. He knew that maintaining an air of confidence and control was essential, not merely to influence the jury, but to reinforce his image of authority to associates, rivals, and the wider public. The defense faced extraordinary challenges. Luciano's operations had left traces, witnesses, and evidence that painted a clear picture of organized activity, and the moral outrage of the time demanded accountability. Corruption, bribery, and manipulation were part of the underworld's fabric, yet presenting a coherent defense required navigating both public opinion and the scrutiny of law enforcement. Legal arguments intertwined with questions of character, ethics, and societal responsibility, transforming the trial into a multidimensional contest in which strategy, rhetoric, and psychological insight were as important as legal precedent. Behind the scenes, the trial was also a contest of influence and negotiation. Luciano's attorneys worked tirelessly to challenge evidence, discredit witnesses, and mitigate the consequences of conviction. The broader strategy involved leveraging connections, understanding political pressures, and identifying potential weaknesses in the prosecution's narrative. Every motion, every procedural decision, and every courtroom maneuver was a carefully calculated step in a battle that extended far beyond the immediate legal outcome. Psychologically, the trial imposed immense pressure on Luciano. The weight of reputation, legacy, and personal survival converged in a confined, public space. Yet he demonstrated remarkable resilience, using intellect, composure, and strategic thinking to navigate a situation that would have overwhelmed most men. He balanced defiance with prudence, projecting confidence while avoiding unnecessary provocation, and carefully managing both allies and adversaries. The courtroom became an extension of his underworld strategy, where psychological acuity was as vital as knowledge of law. The verdict, when it came, marked a turning point. Conviction and sentencing carried consequences not only for Luciano personally but for the structure of his empire. The judgment forced him to confront the fragility of even the most well-constructed networks when faced with the full force of institutional power. The sentence was a public demonstration of the state's authority, yet it also signaled that the underworld was far from eradicated. Luciano's influence, though constrained by prison walls, would endure in ways that were subtle, strategic, and enduring. In the aftermath of the trial, the dynamics of loyalty, betrayal, and power within his organization were tested. Associates, allies, and rivals reassessed their positions, weighing risks and opportunities in a newly transformed landscape. Luciano's absence created both uncertainty and opportunity, yet the structures he had built, the alliances he had forged, and the psychological control he maintained allowed him to exert influence even as a convicted man. The trial demonstrated that while legal systems could impose punishment, true power, rooted in strategy, loyalty, and foresight, could transcend physical confinement. Ultimately, the trial and sentencing of Lucky Luciano were about more than law enforcement, they were a confrontation between order and ambition, morality and pragmatism, fear and respect. The courtroom became a microcosm of the very dynamics that had defined his rise: human behavior, perception, and strategic calculation. It was a defining moment in the narrative of his life, illustrating the tension between brilliance and vulnerability, the limits of invincibility, and the enduring capacity of a calculated mind to influence, control, and survive even under extreme pressure. Even behind the cold, unforgiving walls of prison, lucky Luciano's influence remained far from diminished. While many would have crumbled under the weight of confinement, he transformed incarceration into a new arena of power, a stage where strategy, foresight, and psychological acumen became as vital as ever. Prison, for Luciano, was not simply punishment, it was a challenge to be navigated with precision, an environment in which he could continue to orchestrate his empire while learning lessons in patience, control, and the subtle mechanics of influence. Luciano's understanding of human psychology became even more critical within the confines of prison. He observed the behaviors, fears, and ambitions of fellow inmates, guards, and administrators, recognizing that power could be exercised through relationships, perception, and strategic alliances just as effectively as through physical coercion. By demonstrating calm authority, decisiveness, and the ability to negotiate, he established a network of influence that extended beyond his cell walls. Those around him came to recognize that his reputation was not merely a relic of past achievements, it was an active force, shaping behavior and decisions in ways that reinforced his control. Communication was the lifeline of his continued dominance. Through trusted intermediaries, coded messages, and carefully orchestrated meetings, Luciano maintained contact with his associates on the outside, ensuring that operations continued with minimal disruption. The network he had meticulously built before his incarceration was resilient enough to withstand the challenges of imprisonment, yet it required constant oversight and subtle management to prevent instability. Luciano's ability to direct operations from behind bars underscored his strategic brilliance. Even constrained by walls, he remained a formidable force, orchestrating both protection and expansion of his interests. Power behind bars also demanded careful manipulation of perception. Luciano understood that his fellow inmates, guards, and prison officials all operated under their own pressures, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. By projecting authority and demonstrating calculated decisiveness, he cultivated both respect and fear, establishing a hierarchy in which his influence was unquestioned. He leveraged favors, strategic generosity, and displays of competence to maintain loyalty and compliance, ensuring that his personal authority remained intact despite the formal constraints of incarceration. The external pressures that led to Luciano's imprisonment were mirrored by challenges within the prison itself. Rival inmates, enforcers, and opportunists constantly tested boundaries, seeking advantage in a system defined by scarcity and survival. Luciano navigated these dynamics with precision, balancing firmness with diplomacy, and subtle intimidation with strategic alliances. Each interaction was an opportunity to reinforce authority, neutralize potential threats, or expand influence, turning what could have been a purely punitive experience into a platform for strategic dominance. Luciano also recognized that his long-term survival required adaptability. The structure of the criminal underworld, the ambitions of associates, and the shifting landscape of law enforcement meant that influence could not be static. He adjusted strategies, reallocated resources, and monitored developments from within prison, ensuring that his organization remained cohesive and capable of operating efficiently in his absence. This adaptability was a testament to his foresight, demonstrating an ability to anticipate change and leverage circumstances to maintain advantage even under severe constraint. The psychological toll of incarceration was mitigated by Luciano's ability to compartmentalize and maintain focus. While confinement imposed limitations, it also offered an opportunity for reflection, strategic planning, and analysis of both human behavior and organizational weaknesses. Luciano used this period to refine his approach, anticipate challenges, and strengthen the structural foundations of his empire. His resilience was not merely physical or intellectual, it was deeply psychological, a capacity to endure pressure, maintain clarity of purpose, and act decisively despite adversity. Prison also became a stage for Luciano to exercise negotiation and leverage with authorities. He understood that cooperation, subtle influence, and strategic compromise could yield benefits both for himself and his network. By navigating relationships with officials and identifying mutual interests, he was able to extract concessions, facilitate communication with external allies, and ensure that his organization continued to function effectively. This combination of diplomacy, psychological insight, and strategic patience exemplified his approach to power, adaptable, calculated, and persistent. Even in confinement, Luciano maintained a reputation that transcended the physical space of the prison. His aura of inevitability, the perception of competence, and the psychological leverage he wielded ensured that associates, rivals, and law enforcement alike continued to recognize his authority. Prison became not a limitation but a demonstration of his capacity to influence events, a testament to a mind capable of orchestrating complex systems and relationships even under extreme constraints. By the time he began to consider the next phase of his life, Luciano's period behind bars had reinforced his understanding of power, loyalty, and strategy. The empire he had built did not merely survive his absence, it adapted, evolved, and continued to generate influence under his subtle guidance. His experience in prison illustrated a critical truth: true power is not solely determined by freedom of movement or absence of threat, but by the capacity to manage perception, maintain networks, and leverage human psychology to achieve objectives regardless of circumstance. Ultimately, power behind bars became a defining chapter in Luciano's life, demonstrating that authority, influence, and strategic genius are not confined to open spaces or formal positions of power. Even in captivity, Luciano remained a central figure, a strategist whose mind commanded the loyalty, fear, and respect of those around him. The lessons of this period would reverberate throughout his later life, shaping his approach to exile, diplomacy, and the enduring management of a criminal empire that had grown beyond any single man, yet remained inseparably linked to his vision, intellect, and indomitable presence. Luciano's deportation marked a dramatic turning point in his life, a transition from the streets of New York, where he had built an empire, to a foreign land where his influence was tested in entirely new ways. For a man who had thrived on control, power, and the careful orchestration of networks, exile was both a punishment and an opportunity. Stripped of the physical territory that had defined his authority, Luciano faced the challenge of sustaining relevance and influence from a distance, relying on reputation, strategic alliances, and subtle diplomacy to maintain his position in a world that was no longer entirely under his control. Italy, his homeland, was a landscape both familiar and alien. While culturally resonant, it offered fewer opportunities to exert the kind of power he had wielded in America. The local criminal organizations operated differently, shaped by traditions, hierarchies, and social expectations that contrasted sharply with the structure and discipline of the New York underworld he had engineered. Luciano had to navigate these differences with caution, using his experience, intelligence, and charisma to cultivate influence while avoiding direct confrontation with entrenched powers. His approach mirrored the strategies he had used in America: careful observation, relationship building, and the subtle projection of authority. The exile also forced Luciano into introspection. Removed from the immediate pressures of criminal operations, he reflected on both his achievements and his vulnerabilities. The years of rise, dominance, and incarceration revealed the fragility of power, the unpredictability of loyalty, and the human costs of ambition. Yet rather than succumbing to bitterness, Luciano applied the lessons of his life to adapt to his new circumstances. He understood that influence could be exercised through perception, strategic communication, and carefully managed alliances, even when physical control was limited. During this period, Luciano also maintained connections with his American network, using intermediaries and trusted contacts to monitor operations and exert influence from abroad. While his presence was absent, his authority was sustained through the structures he had built, the culture of loyalty he had instilled, and the reputation that preceded him. Associates on both sides of the Atlantic recognized that Luciano's judgment and directives carried weight, and that his exile was a challenge to navigate rather than an end to his power. This ability to project authority across borders underscored his strategic genius. He had built an empire that could operate independently of his physical presence, yet remained inseparably linked to his guidance. The political and social context of post-war Italy further complicated Luciano's position. The country was rebuilding, institutions were fragile, and local criminal organizations were navigating their own spheres of influence. Luciano leveraged this environment by cultivating relationships with key figures, understanding the motivations of rivals, and positioning himself as a valuable intermediary and strategist. His reputation as a man who had reorganized the American Mafia granted him authority and respect, yet he exercised caution to avoid unnecessary confrontation or exposure. In exile, diplomacy became as crucial a tool as intimidation had been in his previous life. Luciano's final years were marked by a philosophical evolution. Having experienced the heights of power, the depths of betrayal, and the constraints of incarceration, he began to reflect more profoundly on the nature of loyalty, ambition, and human behavior. His strategic mind remained active, but there was an added layer of contemplation about the consequences of choices, the dynamics of influence, and the moral ambiguities that had defined his life. Exile, though restrictive, offered space for this reflection, allowing him to observe, analyze, and understand the world in ways that had been impossible during the relentless pace of his rise and the intensity of his criminal operations. Health, age, and distance also shaped this final chapter. Luciano was no longer the young, audacious strategist who had stormed the streets of New York. His body and mind carried the imprints of decades of risk, confrontation, and survival. Yet even as his physical presence waned, his intellectual capacity and understanding of human nature remained sharp. He continued to influence decisions, mediate disputes, and offer guidance, ensuring that his vision of organized crime, the networks, hierarchies, and psychological dynamics, remained relevant and operational. Exile also amplified the tension between myth and reality. In America, Luciano had been larger than life, a figure of fear, respect, and fascination. In Italy, he had to navigate a more grounded reality, where reputation was influential but could not substitute entirely for tangible power. This period tested his adaptability, patience, and strategic foresight in ways that were distinct from the challenges he had faced in New York or in prison. Luciano's response, measured, calculated, and reflective, demonstrated his capacity to evolve, to wield influence under new constraints, and to maintain relevance despite physical and political distance. Ultimately, the exile and endgame of Luciano's life underscored the enduring tension between ambition and circumstance, influence and limitation, and power and mortality. Though stripped of immediate control over the streets he once dominated, he remained a force whose strategies, decisions, and relationships continued to shape the underworld. His final years became a testament to adaptability, foresight, and the ability to navigate both human behavior and external pressures with intelligence, patience, and subtlety. Luciano's deportation was not merely the closing chapter of his criminal career, it was a reflection of the complex interplay between genius, ambition, and the inevitability of consequences. In exile, he transformed limitations into opportunities for influence, introspection, and strategic intervention, demonstrating that the mind of a visionary leader could operate across borders, time, and circumstance. His life in Italy, though constrained, reflected the same intelligence, adaptability, and psychological mastery that had defined his rise, ensuring that the story of Lucky Luciano remained one of both human complexity and enduring influence. The legacy of Lucky Luciano extends far beyond the streets of New York and the confines of prison walls, reaching into the very architecture of modern organized crime. He was not merely a figure of audacity and ambition, he was a strategist who fundamentally reshaped the structure, methods, and psychology of criminal enterprise. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to blend discipline with pragmatism, fear with respect, and ambition with calculation, principles that would echo through generations of criminal organizations around the world. His influence was not limited to his own lifetime, it became a blueprint for how organized crime could evolve from fragmented, violent gangs into structured, strategic, and resilient networks. One of Luciano's most significant contributions was the creation of a systematized approach to crime. He recognized that the chaotic violence of previous generations undermined long-term stability and profitability. By organizing the Mafia into structured families, with clearly defined hierarchies, roles, and responsibilities, he transformed the underworld into an enterprise that could operate efficiently and predictably. This approach allowed for coordinated operations, minimized internal conflict, and created mechanisms for dispute resolution without constant recourse to violence. In essence, Luciano professionalized crime, creating a model that combined business acumen with enforcement, discipline, and psychological insight. The psychological dimension of his legacy is equally profound. Luciano understood that power was as much about perception, loyalty, and influence as it was about wealth or muscle. He leveraged fear selectively, using it to enforce discipline without alienating allies, and he cultivated loyalty through respect, opportunity, and shared interest. His insight into human behavior allowed him to anticipate betrayal, manage ambition, and maintain cohesion in a volatile environment. This focus on psychological control and strategic influence became a hallmark of modern organized crime, shaping how leaders maintain authority in clandestine and high-stakes contexts. Luciano's methods also had a global impact. By connecting criminal networks across cities and even countries, he anticipated the transnational nature of organized crime that would define the late 20th century. Smuggling routes, gambling operations, and financial channels extended beyond local territories, creating an interconnected web of influence that allowed for both resilience and expansion. Luciano's vision of a coordinated, trans-regional network laid the groundwork for international criminal enterprises, illustrating that the principles of organization, strategic foresight, and psychological insight could be applied on a scale that transcended local or national boundaries. His legacy was not without controversy or moral ambiguity. Luciano's innovations facilitated not only operational efficiency but also unprecedented levels of control and exploitation. The same strategies that ensured loyalty and cohesion also enabled coercion, corruption, and violence on a scale that was unprecedented in the American underworld. Yet it was this duality, combining brilliance with ruthlessness, vision with moral compromise, that made him a figure of both fascination and fear. His life exemplified the tension between human ingenuity and ethical constraint, illustrating how intelligence and strategy can be wielded to both creative and destructive ends. Even after his death, the imprint of Luciano's methods remained evident. The families, alliances, and operational systems he established continued to influence organized crime in New York, across the United States, and abroad. His approach to hierarchy, negotiation, and psychological leverage became standard practice among criminal leaders seeking to consolidate power, manage loyalty, and minimize internal conflict. In many ways, Luciano's innovations anticipated principles of corporate management, demonstrating that leadership in any context, licit or illicit, requires strategy, foresight, and the ability to understand and manipulate human behavior. Culturally, Luciano became a symbol of both ambition and audacity, a man who rose from poverty to power through intelligence, charisma, and calculated risk. His story has been immortalized in books, documentaries, and films, reinforcing his status as an icon of organized crime. Yet beyond the mythos lies the reality of a strategist who understood the mechanics of human behavior, the imperatives of discipline, and the subtleties of influence. His life offers insight into how power can be constructed, maintained, and transmitted, illustrating timeless lessons about leadership, psychology, and the dynamics of complex organizations. Luciano's influence also reshaped the interaction between organized crime and society. By professionalizing operations and minimizing overt violence in certain contexts, he created an enterprise that could operate under the radar of authorities, infiltrate legitimate institutions, and generate sustainable revenue. This approach blurred the lines between legality and illegality, demonstrating how strategic intelligence can exploit social, economic, and political systems. It is this nuanced, sophisticated manipulation of structures, combined with his understanding of human behavior, that cements Luciano's legacy as not merely a criminal, but a visionary strategist whose principles continue to inform the study of crime, psychology, and organizational dynamics. In reflection, Luciano's life and work reveal the complex interplay of ambition, intelligence, and morality. He was a man who understood the imperatives of power, the psychology of loyalty, and the necessity of strategic vision. His innovations in organization, influence, and transnational operations created a template that extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping the evolution of organized crime and offering enduring lessons in leadership, human behavior, and the management of complex systems. Lucky Luciano's legacy is thus a paradoxical testament, a story of brilliance entwined with ruthlessness, strategy intertwined with moral ambiguity, and a life that transformed not only the underworld but the very understanding of how power can be structured, exercised, and preserved across time and space. The story of Lucky Luciano does not end with the closing of a courtroom door, the locking of a prison cell, or even the distance of exile. It stretches beyond the temporal confines of his life, echoing through the streets he once controlled, through the alliances he forged, and through the very blueprint of organized crime he helped construct. To understand Luciano's life in its totality is to confront the paradoxes of ambition, power, and morality. It is to witness a man who could rise from nothing to command empires, yet remain forever vulnerable to forces beyond his control, a man whose brilliance inspired loyalty, fear, and awe, yet whose choices imposed costs that no wealth or strategy could erase. The conclusion of his story, therefore, is not merely the end of a criminal career, it is a meditation on the human condition, on the interplay between genius and fallibility, and on the fragile, complex architecture of influence. From the streets of Sicily to the docks and alleys of New York, Luciano's journey was marked by audacity and a relentless pursuit of opportunity. His rise was cinematic in scope, the impoverished immigrant boy navigating a world of violence and discrimination, the street hustler learning early that the only way to survive, and thrive, was to understand power, psychology, and the nuances of human behavior. These formative experiences shaped the man who would later orchestrate a revolution in organized crime, transforming it from chaotic street-level gang warfare into a disciplined, strategic enterprise capable of spanning cities, states, and eventually continents. His life was a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, strategy, and vision, yet it was also a study in the costs of ambition, the betrayals endured, the lives destroyed, and the constant dance with danger that defined his existence. The contrast between myth and reality in Luciano's story is stark. Popular imagination has immortalized him as the suave, untouchable Don, charismatic, stylish, and audaciously powerful. Films, documentaries, and novels often focus on the spectacle, the sharp suits, the cigar-smoking presence, the public displays of confidence, and the daring operations that cemented his legend. But beneath this glamorous facade lies the disciplined, calculating mind of a strategist who understood the delicate balance of fear, respect, and loyalty. His ability to anticipate behavior, manage complex networks, and orchestrate both cooperation and coercion was what truly set him apart. The myth emphasizes the drama, the reality reveals the precision, the psychological insight, and the strategic mastery that allowed him to survive, and often thrive, where others would fail. Luciano's influence extends far beyond the underworld itself. His organizational reforms, establishing clear hierarchies, operational systems, and methods of dispute resolution, transformed the way criminal enterprises could function. What had once been a landscape defined by arbitrary violence and territorial disputes became a network of structured families capable of enduring pressure, maintaining cohesion, and expanding influence. By professionalizing crime, he ensured that loyalty could be cultivated, ambition could be channeled, and operations could be coordinated with a level of efficiency previously unseen. His insights into human behavior, understanding when to inspire fear, when to reward loyalty, and when to negotiate strategically, became as central to his empire as money, weapons, or territory. Even in exile, Luciano's presence was felt, demonstrating that power is not always tied to physical proximity or direct enforcement. From Italy, he continued to influence operations in the United States, relying on intermediaries, trusted associates, and a reputation that commanded deference. His life in exile was not one of passive reflection but of active, albeit subtler, strategy. He advised, mediated, and ensured continuity, shaping decisions and resolving disputes even from afar. The ability to project authority across borders and through layers of intermediaries underscored his genius. Luciano had built an empire that could operate independently, yet remained inseparable from his strategic vision and psychological control. Luciano's story also serves as a meditation on morality and consequence. Every empire he built rested on acts that were coercive, violent, and illicit. Yet to reduce his life to mere criminality is to miss the deeper lessons of strategy, foresight, and human understanding that defined his genius. Luciano navigated environments in which legal, ethical, and moral frameworks were either absent or hostile, and he did so with a combination of pragmatism and intelligence. The tension between brilliance and ruthlessness, vision and moral compromise, is what gives his life its complexity. It forces reflection on the duality of human ambition, the capacity for extraordinary creation and influence, alongside the inescapable costs imposed upon others and oneself. The contrast between his meteoric rise and the vulnerabilities he later faced also adds profound psychological and emotional depth to his story. The invincibility he projected in his prime was tested through incarceration, betrayal, and the distance of exile. Yet even as his physical control waned, his mind remained active, his strategy adaptive, and his influence enduring. The narrative arc from street hustler to underworld architect, from kingpin to exile, illustrates the impermanence of even the most carefully constructed power structures, emphasizing that control is always provisional, shaped by both human behavior and external forces. Cinematically, the conclusion draws together the themes of rise, fall, and enduring influence. The streets that once celebrated his audacity became silent witnesses to the man in exile, reflecting both the continuity and fragility of his empire. The courtroom drama, the prison maneuvers, and the final years of exile all serve to underscore the tension between brilliance and vulnerability. Each episode contributes to a narrative of human complexity, a man who could inspire loyalty and fear, who could strategize across continents, yet who was ultimately subject to the unyielding realities of mortality, law, and circumstance. Luciano's story also resonates because it challenges the viewer to grapple with the nature of power itself. Influence, he demonstrated, is constructed not solely through coercion or wealth, but through understanding, foresight, and the manipulation of perception. Authority is maintained not just through action but through psychological insight, anticipating ambition, predicting behavior, and orchestrating loyalty. In this sense, Luciano's life offers lessons far beyond the criminal context, illuminating principles relevant to leadership, strategy, and the dynamics of human networks in any high-stakes environment. Even in death, the legacy of Luciano persisted. The systems he established, the principles he articulated, both practical and psychological, continued to shape organized crime for decades. Families and networks he once controlled adapted, evolved, and maintained the structures he had put in place. His influence became institutionalized, a testament to the enduring power of foresight, strategic intelligence, and the careful cultivation of human behavior. While the man himself was mortal, the frameworks he created transcended his lifetime, ensuring that his presence was felt long after his passing. Ultimately, the conclusion of Lucky Luciano's story is both an ending and a reflection, a meditation on ambition, morality, and the intricate interplay of strategy, psychology, and circumstance. It leaves the viewer with a complex portrait, a man of audacious vision and strategic genius, tempered by human vulnerability and moral ambiguity. Luciano's life challenges us to consider the costs of power, the nature of loyalty, and the enduring tension between brilliance and consequence. It is a narrative that fascinates not merely because of the criminal exploits it recounts, but because it illuminates timeless truths about human behavior, leadership, and the intricate dynamics of influence. As the curtain falls on the life of Lucky Luciano, we are left with a portrait of paradox. He was a visionary who reshaped the underworld, a strategist whose influence transcended geography and circumstance, and a human being whose ambition, intellect, and morality were constantly in tension. He demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to adapt, manipulate, and create order from chaos, yet he also bore the human costs of a life lived on the edge of legality and morality. The story of Luciano, therefore, is more than a criminal biography. It is a psychological, historical, and moral journey through the complexities of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the consequences of ambition. In the final analysis, Lucky Luciano's narrative resonates because it is both universal and extraordinary. It is the story of ambition pursued with intelligence and daring, of power wielded with calculation and psychological insight, and of vulnerability that reminds us of the limits of control. His legacy endures not merely as myth, but as a reflection of strategy, human behavior, and the delicate, often precarious architecture of influence. To study Luciano is to study the mechanics of power itself, the ways in which human intelligence, foresight, and psychological acuity can shape, sustain, and, ultimately, transcend circumstance. It is a story that leaves the audience with both admiration and caution, fascination and reflection, reminding us that genius and human complexity are inseparable, and that the echoes of one man's life can resonate far beyond the boundaries of his existence.